When you said it's dangerous, what do you mean? Like in terms of like if you come out and start speaking about this, promoting it, you're putting yourself in danger.
That's not what I mean, but that's also probably true.
Hmm.
If unless you have like, a pretty big presence and therefore it would be awkward to make you disappear. But the bigger thing is just if you think about what unlimited energy can produce, and if especially if you look at it from the classical perspective of E equals MC squared, a lot of people would say, well, what we see in that video can't be real with the plane disappearing because the amount of energy required to make a wormhole is so massive. And when you're dealing with those types of energy levels, and that might not even be the limit, then it's like, okay, what's stopping me from actually producing a black hole, a real black hole?
Right.
Like, not just like what CERN was doing. Basically, CERN is using like little spit shooters. They're never going to make a black hole with that. We don't even need particle accelerators like that.
Mm.
Attosecond lasers, the reason why people are winning Nobel Prizes in 2023 for an attosecond laser is the shorter the interval that you can make your laser, the more powerful it is.
Mm.
And now we've reached the point where it's almost approaching where the time period in which the virtual particles are like getting created out of the ether, even according to mainstream
Oh,
physics. These
right.
virtual particles are like basically being created and getting destroyed, and we can manipulate them using something called the dynamic Casimir effect, which basically spins a mirror so fast, and we can do it in other ways, where the particles get pulled out of the ether and make them real photons.
Hmm.
This is so important because what does real photons getting pulled out of the ether sound like? Sounds like a glowing ball of light. And that's exactly what we're seeing with a lot of these UFOs these days. We're not really seeing a lot of flying saucer stuff anymore. It's
Right.
mostly like balls of energy and balls of light. The government's figured out that in the 60s with the SR-71 Blackbird, potentially even before that, they figured out in order to achieve hypersonic speeds, you create a plasma sheath in front of your craft. This reduces drag. Otherwise, whatever's in your craft is gonna not gonna be the friction is gonna rip the plane apart. Person's gonna melt inside of it, what have you. This plasma sheath pulls the plane forward as well. It actually has an acceleration effect associated to it. What they realized was that why do we have a plane at all? Why not just make the plasma sheath our thing that flies around? Ken Shoulders was probably one of the smartest engineers that figured out exotic vacuum objects, where these balls of plasma, they naturally form into spherical shapes, self-organizing properties.
Hmm.
In fact, they're simple to produce. This is what the letter to Ashton Forbes wanted me to know. They wanted me to know, hey, those balls of plasma you see that you correctly identified as superconductive harmonic orbs, they induce superconductivity in these balls of plasma state, and they have a natural asymmetry, thinking like to the battery, naturally form electron charge clusters, just like a battery has a negative charge on one side, very, very dense ones.
Hmm.
So these plasmas are like just the perfect conditions for what we would want for free energy, for a circuit that's permanently open, and fusion. We're talking not just free energy. There's more. Transmutation and conjuring of elements. We can actually manifest hydrogen directly out of the ether. So the most basic element. And then these few balls of fusion, these balls of plasma also transmute elements. So there's a real reality, not right now, but at some point in the future where we will just have Star Trek replicators.
Mm.
Earl Grey, hot, right?
Would you trust it? Like, would you trust
Me?
what
No,
comes
I'll
out
be
of it?
long dead since then, thankfully. But
If you were alive, or we could transport you through a wormhole into the future, would you trust using the stuff that tech could make?
I'm not going to be the first person, no way. And I plan to die on this planet and not on Alpha Centauri or one of the, the Andromeda Galaxy as well. I'm an old school person like that.
Uh-huh.
But I do love the science and technology of it. So
Hmm.
to me, clearly what had happened is that sometime after the 60s, probably between the 60s and the 90s, we figured out our black project engineers that work for Lockheed, Northrop, all the Boeing, all these defense contractors,
Yeah.
they figured out plasma self-organizes. And they were like, oh, we now have drone capability. We don't need to mess around with fighter jets and spy planes anymore. Also, it's a liability to whoever's flying in there.
Right.
It's just easier to have a self-organizing ball of plasma. We put like a small device in it, and now we can
Hmm.
just radio control it.
Hmm.
But radio waves don't penetrate plasma or salt water. So it's kind of a difficult problem for submarines and floating balls of plasma. However, there's a patent by a guy named Hal Puthoff that is a scalar communication device, gravity communication device,
Well,
where there's no electromagnetic field, and instead it uses potentials through the ether, through the medium. This is literally scalar. This is Hal Puthoff knows that gravity manipulation is possible. And when he words his patent, he does it in a way where he faces the least amount of criticism. He
Right.
doesn't say gravity communication device. It's just called communication system.
Right.
And it's like it uses the Ehrenhoff-Bohm effect and zeroing out electric magnetic fields. And I'm looking at them like, dude, what? And so this is how you communicate with submarines, plasmas that you want to remote control, because they can measure the phase change, which
Wow.
means that like if you have this wave going through the medium, then it's a little bit off from its starting point, and that's a phase change. And they can use that like Morse code, and they can then communicate.
What you're saying makes the conversation I had a few weeks ago about weather modifications seem less crazy, because the part of the conversation was, okay, maybe they're not trying to actually steer the hurricane. They're messing with the elements around it, right? Which is what you're saying with the plane going super fast and trying to manipulate or get rid of that friction and stuff. And then on top of that, there's people we've talked to on this show who talk about, going back to the UFO stuff, which could connect to your breakaway civilization theory. A lot of them say, you've probably heard this, they're sending whomever they are, crafts that are unmanned. And perhaps that's going also to what you're saying, because that breakaway civilization or whatever they are learned, we could just send these things and they could, like a drone, they have an avatar inside that's not the real being. So that seems possible.
Yeah, the weather manipulation thing, a lot of people ask me about my opinion on that because I've been talking about scalar physics and this plasmas and all this stuff. And yeah, of course we can manipulate the weather. We can send energy into a storm or remove energy from a storm, but can we control the weather? That's a different, a whole different ball game at that point. I think that it does seem feasible that we could increase the magnitude of a storm or decrease it through energy manipulation and also potentially try to slightly modify the path. I don't know if we could directly force a storm onto a certain area, but this is why you've got people like Into Thin Air and Dutchson's looking at weather phenomenon. They're looking at the NEXRAD radars because they know that a radar is not just a detection system, it's also a projection system. Like you're literally beaming electromagnetic waves at objects, and that's how we detect them. And then you realize, oh, well, I can now just put that through a phase conjugate crystal, and now it produces a scalar beam. And you're like,
it was
that's not
actually
even complicated.
It was actually Into Thin Air who was making that point I made from a few weeks ago on Tim's show. But I don't know if they can control weather, but I think they can make weather, and then it's chaotic. But I think there's probably other people in power who are able to do it better. I don't know how successful Operation Popeye was in Vietnam, though they certainly tried to accelerate the monsoon season during the Vietnam War, and that's forever ago in terms of science and technology. So who knows what they're doing now? And then in the 40s, even 20 years before the Vietnam War, they were trying to steer hurricanes. And there's no real definitive proof that's been declassified that they have. But knowing that they were trying probably means they didn't stop, Which is the same stuff what you talk about, knowing that they've been trying to develop certain technology for decades. You're talking about stuff since like the 40s and 50s. They didn't stop, and who knows what they've got now.